wide range of topics, and we've got a new topic for him to talk about. This is the 75th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. Chris will talk about that. Chris is the executive director of the Veterans Museum, made a great contribution to the Veterans Museum and to the state of Wisconsin overall. He's heavily involved in the creation of the new Veterans Museum, which I suspect he'll spend a minute or two telling us, updating us about as well. Welcome, Chris Kolakowski.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. It's great to be back with everybody. Can you all hear me in the back okay? If you cannot at any time, just do that, and I'm more than happy to speak up. By show of hands, how many of you have been to the Veterans Museum before? I'm assuming most of you have. Excellent. For the few of you who haven't, what's keeping you? Please come down and see us. We've got some great stuff going on right now. We've actually got an exhibit up right now through the end of the year, partly a traveling exhibit from the artist Keith Rocco, but also partly our story of Wisconsin at D-Day. So if you get a chance, come on down and check it out.
Not on Mondays.
Not on Mondays, that's right. That's right. We're closed on Mondays, but we're open every other day of the week. With regard to the future museum, which by the time it's all done and sweating all the pieces into place, I expect my hairline's going to look like Bill's, but all for a good cause. We are in the process of acquiring the building, exercising our option to buy. The landlord is making it a little bit of a winding road, but we're on our way. The governor's budget that was just signed on July 1st includes the planning money for the next phase, which is engineering and also preliminary exhibit design. So we are keeping up the momentum, and in 2 years we'll be able to go to the legislature and say, here's what it's going to take, and with the assistance of our partner foundation and our members, this is what it's going to take, and oh, by the way, we won't come back to you later and say we forgot to carry the one. So we're pretty excited about that, keeping the momentum going. All things going well, 2 years from now, I will be here probably telling you, guess what, come and see us before we close. For 3 years, while we become a big hole in the ground, we're on the same path as the History Museum across the street, just a few years behind. I will tell you, just to head off any questions on this, and then we'll actually get to Korea. One of the things we are doing right now is we are planning for an interim space. We've got a couple of storefronts around the square that we're looking at, we're talking to the landlords about, trying to get a multi-year lease to keep it open, keep some displays there, keep the store going. One of the things I learned transitioning the Patton Museum at Fort Knox is you don't want people to learn to live without you. And so we very much still want to be around and still be a part of the community. So we're working all of that stuff. More to follow, but that is the very basic version this evening. Again, come on down and see us at the Veterans Museum. We've got some great stuff going on. And of course, Navy birthday, 250th next month. Marine Corps birthday, November 10th, the following month. We're doing ceremonies in the Capitol both days, including cake cutting. So, there you go. Anyway, what we're here tonight to talk about is Korea. How many of you have ever either been stationed there or traveled to the Korean Peninsula? Through the air. Okay.
Yeah.
That'll work. Yeah, I know. 35. The closest I've been is 35,000 feet too, so I get that. So what we're going to talk about tonight is a highly relevant conflict, and in many ways, it's a conflict that's still with us. It's America's longest war by some measures. We'll talk about why in a little bit. This is what we're going to spend our time on tonight. I'm going to give you the strategic setting. Where is Korea? How do we get, how does things develop? We're going to talk a little bit about the road to war. Talk about some of the stages of the war, as you can see there, 2, 3, and 4, and then the long road to the armistice at the end. And I'll give you some concluding remarks about the relevance and just kind of bring it up to today, if you will. So that's what we're going to do. I'm looking forward to questions. Obviously, we'll take them at the end, but looking forward to some great discussion. So, where are we in the world? This is Northeast Asia. And actually, I just realized I don't have to stand here and point. I have a cursor. So I can use that as my pointer. Okay, so north is at the top. Of course, this is a modern map. This is the Soviet Union, today Russia. Here's China. Can you all see that cursor good enough? Sort of? Okay, I can also point. So here's China. Here's Japan. And right here in the middle of the map is the Korean Peninsula. It's obviously South Korea, North Korea, Korean Peninsula from the very northern tip where it shares 12 miles of border with Russia. Never forget that. That actually impacts the Korean War, the Ukraine war a bit. Makes it easy for the North Koreans to transfer. People forget that. It's mostly borders China, but there's 12 miles of border with the Russians. But from that point down to the southern tip of South Korea is 420 miles. At its narrowest point, the Korean Peninsula is 200 miles across. Very mountainous terrain. Well, you'll see photographs. I'll give you a better feel for that as we go. Of course, you see how it's divided. We'll talk about that. South Korea, the capital is Seoul. North Korea, the capital is Pyongyang. Divided roughly at the 38th parallel. The 43rd parallel cuts right at the very top of the peninsula. See that very northeast corner up there, that little finger? That ends at the 43rd parallel. Now, why do you think I bring that up?
That's where Madison is.
Madison is on the 43rd parallel.
Oh.
Yes. So, that'll win you a bar bet one day. Fun other fact, Japanese home islands from northern Hokkaido all the way down to Kyushu are roughly the same latitudes as the continental United States, as the lower 48. Another bar bet for you to win. I'm looking at you, Bill. But that's where we are, just to give you an idea of kind of where we are in the world at this point. Just to give you, put us, I always like to start with a good map of where we are. So where does our story start? Our story starts, as do many stories of conflicts in the last 80 years, in World War II and its immediate aftermath. 2nd September 1945, Japan surrenders. Japan had ruled Korea as they called it a protectorate. It's really a dominion. They were trying to eliminate the Korean culture and language from 1910 to 1945. When Japan surrenders, the decision is made to administratively divide the peninsula at the 38th parallel. All Japanese troops north of the 38th parallel will surrender to the Soviets. All Japanese troops south of the 38th parallel will surrender to the Americans. That fairly quickly turns into an international border. Because if you know anything about the years immediately after World War II, you know that when the Russians showed up, they tend to like to set up puppet governments. They're doing it in Eastern Europe, they're doing it in a lot of places, and they certainly do it here on the Korean Peninsula. And by 1948, it has completely hardened. This supposed temporary division of the Korean Peninsula has hardened into an international boundary. And you get the foundation of two countries. We'll talk about them and their leaders here in just a second. 1949, China falls to the communists. Chinese Civil War between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. Most people think the war ends in 1949, but the last nationalist armies don't actually evacuate it to Taiwan until the spring of 1950. Of course, NATO was founded in the wake of the Berlin airlift, the Berlin crisis. So there's a lot going on in the world. This is a period of tremendous transformation in the years leading up to the Korean War. Now, here are the two leaders and the two visions. The guy up here in the upper right with General MacArthur, who has his own Wisconsin connections, by the way, General Douglas MacArthur, that is Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee is 70 years old. He has spent his entire life working for Korean independence. He actually went to the Versailles Conference in 1919, just like Ho Chi Minh, and wasn't able to get any traction, just like Ho Chi Minh. Syngman Rhee is Democratic, and he's the president of the Republic of Korea, South Korea. He's Democratic, but he's Democratic to a point. Because he really, what he calls undesirable elements, particularly communists, he wants to limit their influence in his government, which leads him down some, shall we say, less than democratic paths, but nonetheless, he is a Democrat, even if it's on a limited basis. He's also the only UN-recognized government on the Korean Peninsula at this point, is the South Koreans, the Republic of Korea. This guy here is his counterpart in Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung, who is the president of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. He's still the president of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is really impressive since he's been dead since 1994. He was named after his death as the eternal president of North Korea. It's his grandson that now rules the DPRK. Kim Jong-il was his son, Kim Jong-un. I always sometimes get that mixed up. But that's Kim Il-sung. And if you go to North Korea, if you read anything about North Korea, he's the godfather of that country. In a way that Mao is for the People's Republic of China, or in a way that Lenin and Stalin were for the Soviet Union. Both of them want to unify the peninsula under their rule. Except advisors, the United States and the Soviet Union pulled out by 1949 and basically left the two of them to figure out what they're going to do. There were border clashes along the 38th parallel as both armies are testing each other and seeing, do we really want to escalate this? And there are pro-communist risings in the southern part of South Korea. So Kim Il-sung is definitely working, of course, and so is Syngman Rhee. They both want Korea under their leadership. So that brings us to the road to war. I first developed this lecture years ago for NATO when I was in Norfolk, Virginia. And one of the lessons I used to teach them was that words matter. Read this book. This is what the Joint Chiefs of Staff says about Korea in June of 1948. Korea is of little strategic value, and any commitment would be ill-advised and impractical. That's in a public strategy document. Douglas MacArthur, public statement, September 1949. He's still in Japan running the occupation. South Korea is in no danger of being overrun by North Korea. As long as South Korea is not a threat, no action will be taken by the Kremlin, in other words the Soviets, to absorb it, as there's nothing to gain. Okay? And then, in a speech to the National Press Club, the U.S. Secretary of State says this in January of 1950. Our defensive perimeter, which is an interesting phrase in and of itself, runs along the Aleutians to Japan and then down the Ryugus through Okinawa. From the Ryugus to the Philippines. So far as the military security of other areas of the Pacific are concerned, it must be clear no person can guarantee them against enemy attack. What's left out? Korea. This is widely reported in the press. And a week later, my effort to be dramatic is not working, Kim Il-sung has the Soviet ambassador send this message. Kim thinks he needs to visit Stalin again in order to receive instructions and launch an offensive. Kim Il-sung begins to push what he calls the reunification plan. In other words, an offensive against the South to take it over and try to enter the communist government. He visits Moscow at the end of January 1950. Stalin, after several days of discussion, says, okay, great, but if you get in trouble, don't come to me. The Soviets are still recovering from World War II. But the victorious Chinese, just over your border, Mao will back you, then they're good to go. And mid-May 1950, after the last nationalist forces had left China, Mao says, yes, if something happens, I'll back you. And so that brings us to the eve of war. I need to put one more actor on our stage before we actually get into it. And that is the United States forces in the Far East. The United States has advisors in South Korea. They're not under General MacArthur, they're an independent command. There are significant defense budget battles in Washington. The United States military in 1950, just to give you an idea, the United States Army had, most regiments had only 2 battalions. They're normally supposed to have 3. Look at that percentage of annual personnel turnover. 43%. I don't care what organization you run. If you turn over 43% of your people every year, how effective are you going to be? Okay? And equipment is mostly World War II vintage. As a matter of fact, a lot of them have been sitting in warehouses for 3 or 4 years. And when they pull out some of the Jeeps and trucks and take them over to Korea, the tires have dry rot and will dry rot on the Korean War. There's only 4 divisions, as you can see, on occupation duty in Japan. So, are we ready to, as they say now, in U.S. Forces Korea, fight tonight? I would say probably not. But that's the state of the U.S. forces. 25th of June, 1950, the invasion of Korea starts. North Koreans push south with all the red arrows. I'm going to show you a lot of maps, by the way. They may look like Rorschach tests at a distance, but once you absorb the general implications. They'll push south, just south of the 38th parallel. You see where all the arrows converge on Seoul. They'll catch the South Koreans by surprise, And in the course of a matter of weeks, by the 1st of August, they'll have pushed back into this perimeter right here, known as the Pusan perimeter. Within weeks of the war starting, they will have captured 85% of the Korean Peninsula. And it will look like they're very close to victory. The reason that they aren't able to finish the victory is because of the reaction of the United Nations. UN, as I mentioned, South Korea is the only recognized UN-recognized government on the Korean Peninsula. The UN Security Council, over a series of days in late June of 1950, passes a resolution. First of all, North Korea stopped the invasion. Second of all, UN forces help secure the freedom and security of South Korea, and then also the United States will take the lead on this. President Harry Truman, General Douglas MacArthur, UN Command is what it will be known as, and they will be the leader of the coalition. So this becomes the first UN war. Now you all may be wondering, why do the Soviets, who have a permanent veto on the National Security or the UN Security Council, not do anything? That's because Stalin has had his guy boycott the UN because China, he wants Mao to have the Chinese seat instead of Chiang Kai-shek. They will come back to take their seat, their rotating chairmanship, but that won't be till the 1st of August. So the Soviets let this happen. It's one of the more interesting miscalculations of Stalin's career. So the United States sends over, as the vanguard of the rest of the 8th Army, as they begin to pack up and get ready to move over, Task Force Smith, 400 men from the 21st Infantry Regiment. And they go forward thinking, oh, the North Koreans, as soon as they see American troops, they'll turn and run. They see North Korean troops. They quickly discover that many of their artillery shells are duds. Their bazooka rounds bounce off the Russian tanks. Some of them are duds as well. And within basically a day's worth of fighting south of Seoul, will be overrun with 50% losses. Ever since, no more Task Force Smiths is a watchword for defense preparedness in Washington. Still here today. The United States starts a global reinforcement effort for Korea. They start combing troops from all over the place, including Marines. The 1st Marine Division includes Marines that had been stationed in the Mediterranean when the war started. And by September of 1950, they're in Korea. The Army does the same thing. Global reinforcement effort for Korea. And of course, 8th Army begins to cross over and begins to join the South Korean Army in trying to hold the Pusan perimeter. Now, one advantage is all through the war, the UN will have, and I say the UN, I will use the UN, I'll probably slip into saying Americans, I'll probably slip into saying we a few times. I'm just going to warn you right now. We dominate the air and the sea the whole war. There's not an appreciable, there is a challenge, but there's not an appreciable air or sea challenge from the North Koreans. And so that's an advantage that the UN will have the whole time. So MacArthur says, let's hold on to the Pusan perimeter. Where's his responsibility? And let's plan on turning the tide at Incheon. We'll talk about that as we go. I want to talk real quick about the Pusan perimeter. This is 6 weeks of fighting, which consummates next week. August 1st to September 15th, 1950. This is one of the great stands in the history of the United States Army. Everything else that we talk about doesn't happen if we don't hold the Pusan perimeter. By the way, there's a book back there for sale by Edward P. Lloyd. I highly recommend if you want to read about it. This guy here is a forgotten hero, Walton Walker. He's the commander of 8th Army. It is through his personal leadership and the leadership of many of his subordinates, we'll talk about them in a minute, that helps hold this line. You get a sense of his determination. This is actually him during the battle with his staff. They called him Bulldog because when he got determined, you get a bulldog expression on his face. You can see the determination to hold the perimeter. But even so, the North Koreans bash it back and reduce it by 50% size by about now, 75 years ago now. And it's not just Walker doing it. This guy up here in the upper corner is Iron Mike Michaelis. The 27th Wolfhound Regiment was the fire brigade for 8th Army. They were always the ultimate reserve, and if Walker needed a counterattack in a hurry, Michaelis and his regiment seemed to always be there to help hold the line. This guy up here in the right-hand corner, Paik Sun-yup, who was from North Korea. He was originally from the part that became North Korea. commands a South Korean division, and actually tells his troops as they're breaking right here near Daegu, in a critical moment of the battle, he tells them, if we run now, Korea is done for. And they turn around and go back. He later becomes the first 4-star general in the South Korean Army. I recommend his memoir. And then just to illustrate, these 3 guys all earned the Medal of Honor for leadership under fire during the Pusan perimeter battle. This guy right here, who's buried in the Fort Knox cemetery, Ernest Kuma, fought all night with 1 tank, held off a North Korean battalion, and then drove back through enemy lines the next morning and reported, "Sir, I'm wounded, I'm out of ammunition, but I'm ready to go back. You've done enough." But it's that kind of determination and teamwork that holds on to Korea by its fingernails. Now, meanwhile, MacArthur is looking at Incheon. He's looking at the possibility of going around behind the North Koreans and landing near Seoul at the port of Incheon and cutting them off. It's an iterative plan. Originally, he's going to use the 1st Cavalry Division. They get sucked into Pusan. Same with the 2nd Division and the 5th Marines. And finally, on the 15th of September 1950, 70,000 men of the Marines, 1st Division, and the 7th U.S. Army Division will land. This was not exactly looked upon favorably by many Army and Navy officers, both in Washington and in Tokyo. Incheon is a port right on a very narrow channel, and it has some of the highest tides in the world. As one of the officers in Washington later said, if I was to list all the reasons not to land somewhere, Incheon has them all. MacArthur's response, that's exactly why they won't see me coming. He also says, and this is the first time I've ever seen this phrase used, I have more faith in the Navy Marine Corps team than they do in themselves. And that's the first time I've ever heard Navy Marine Corps team. It's another bar back for you. And on the 15th of September 1950, still today the only last opposed amphibious landing in American military history, U.S. 10th Corps will land in Incheon. The next day, 8th Army will begin to break out of the Pusan perimeter, having fought the North Koreans pretty well with frazzle. And you can see very quickly, they push, and within about a week and a half, push the 180 miles, link up. Most of the North Korean Army gets destroyed here. The rest start fleeing north for the 38th parallel. Seoul falls by the 29th of September. And by October 1st, you're back to the 38th parallel. They have reversed all of the North Korean gains that quickly. These are the Marines going over the wall at Incheon. It's that guy is from Wisconsin. Don't ask me his name, I forgot. I'm blanking on it. Anybody know where the ladders they're using? This tells you how improvised this landing was. You know where those ladders came from? Tokyo Fire Department. And here's MacArthur with the commander of 10th Corps, Ed Almond, watching some of this, obviously, from the command. So now the question is, by October 1st, what do you do? You're back at the 38th parallel. The question is, do you go north or do you stop? The UN resolution of the 7th of October 1950, which is passed over the veto of the Security Council, but what's called the Atchison Plan, because if the Security Council won't act, the United Nations General Assembly can act on its own. Sets a very important precedent. Says go north, unify Korea if possible. The Joint Chiefs of Staff also tells MacArthur, and this is a direct quote, you are to regard yourself as unhampered tactically and strategically. The light could not be greener, could it? And so they start to push north. Everybody begins to flood north. All the UN command floods north. At this point, Mao gets the Indian ambassador out of bed in the middle of the night and tells him, you need to tell your friends in the West that if they get close to the Yalu River, we will be compelled to act. Those warnings are discounted. And on the 15th of October, Truman flies to Wake Island to meet with General MacArthur. They talk about the war, they talk about the end of the war, potential occupation of Korea, and in a very interesting foreshadowing of the future, 20% of this agenda is about Indochina. Vietnam, it's about the French. Make of that what you will. MacArthur later says this was a photo op, although if you read, and I think it's very true in David McCullough's biography, These guys, this is the only meeting they actually had face-to-face, and if you read their contemporary accounts, they actually went away very happy with each other. Of course, that will change. So, as October turns into November, the flood north, you see all the blue arrows as they push north toward the Yalu River. And by late November, right around the time of Thanksgiving, right as MacArthur issues orders for what's called the Home by Christmas Offensive, yes, it is called that. First rule of warfare, the troops are never home by Christmas. But he forgot that. See this dashed line at the top? The top of the map there? That's the high water mark. That's the high water mark of the UN Advance. And you can see in the very top of the corner, they actually reached the Yalu at a town called Hyesanjin on November 21st, 1950. There's a photograph taken of some of the generals looking into China. A few days later, 300,000 Chinese volunteers announced their presence with authority. This is the longest retreat in the history of the United States Army. A retreat from actually the very top of the map, back down, the 8th Army from north of Pyongyang, back through Pyongyang, and they'll end up by the end of the year at the 38th parallel. Let's look at this in detail. But I wanted to start with this to give you kind of an overall schematic. This is what one of the Chinese human wave attacks looks like. This is actually from the Chinese official history. This is their perspective, attacking us in the snow. Remember the real bad winter we had a couple of years ago in 2022, when there was a real horrible cold around Christmas? That's the kind of weather that they were fighting. Just in case you're wondering, as you look at these photographs, the Marines and some attached Army troops will begin to retreat from the Chosun Reservoir back down, and this is what it looks like. These guys, they get wounded, it's so cold that their blood freezes. You know what they survive on? Tootsie Rolls. Because you can suck on it, it gives you sugar, energy, and then you swallow it, and it fills your stomach. And they lived on that. In fact, if you visit for years at reunions of the Chosun Reservoir veterans, there would always be a bowl of Tootsie Rolls for anybody who wanted. This is what it looks like on a map. They retreat from Hagaru-ri 66 miles through the mountains on one road, attacked by Chinese from all directions, virtually the whole way. They also, and this is a tremendous commentary on American ingenuity. Right here is Funchilin Pass. It's a tall bridge and water course that's over a 2,500-foot gulch. Chinese had blown a hole in the road, blown a hole in the bridge. There were bridge engineers in that column, but they didn't have any bridging equipment. So in 24 hours, the United States Air Force figures out how to drop a bridge in there, enough bridge sections for them to bridge the pass. And they do it. And they get the column moving again. They bring out all their wounded. As Chesty Puller, who was in this column, will later say, it's not a retreat. We're attacking in another direction. And they make it to Hungnam by mid-December. They make it back to the sea. Meanwhile, over on the other end of the line, this is actually 8th Army engineers fighting Chinese from behind a bulldozer. I tell you, if you read the accounts of these battles, I know how it ends, but even I get anxious when you start reading the accounts of the Chinese soldiers getting in behind. Because one of the things the Chinese, they traveled light, and they realized all we got to do is cut the road, and everybody gets really antsy, particularly in these mountains, in the mountainous terrain. You cut the road, you start threatening the line of communication south, particularly a road-bound army like this, and it's going to create problems. And you can see the effect. I mean, they come in right on the flank of the 8th Army and force them ultimately to retreat. As 8th Army's falling back, U.S., Korean, and British forces are concentrating on the port of Hungnam. This is known as, I call it the American Dunkirk. Here's General Ullman with naval commanders. In 12 days, from December 12th to December 24th, 1950, we get over 105,000 American, British, and South Korean forces out with equipment. But here's something else, and I used to use this to teach moral courage at Fort Knox to officer cadets. Ullman's orders are silent what to do with the 98,000 Korean refugees who have packed everything they can carry and have flooded the port as well, desperately trying to get out. Legally, he could leave them on the beach. But he says, you know what? All excess shipping space, give it to the refugees. They packed 5,000 into some of those LSTs. There's one merchant ship that has 14,000. 5 children, that's her. Five children are born at sea on the way to Busan. And they get them all out. They get them all out. We'll come back to that. This is the end. Merry Christmas. We're going to blow your port up. But nonetheless, despite this successful withdrawal, there is no question this has been a defeat. And as MacArthur tells Truman, we face an entirely new war. There's serious implications for Chinese entry, both in terms of do we go nuclear, but also, now that the Chinese are in here, do we go after them in Manchuria? Well, if we go after the Chinese, they have a mutual defense pact with the Soviets. If that mutual defense pact is activated, where does the front line become? Berlin. Which, if you remember the Berlin crisis, the Berlin airlift a couple of years before, there are a lot of European countries that are like, hey, wait a second. We signed up to help South Korea. We didn't sign up for World War III. And so you start to get this debate, and Britain helps kind of broker it a little bit, and there's a controversy with MacArthur at this point. MacArthur's opinion is, this is the war communism chose. There's no substitute for victory. Let's fight it here. And he said this, if we don't solve it now, we'll be here in 2 generations. Truman and his advisors and his European partners are saying, wrong war, wrong time, wrong place. And so you start to get a difference of opinion as to what exactly is war and how wide this war should be. Walker dies in a Jeep accident right before Christmas 1950. Matthew Ridgway is flown on very short notice. He leaves a Christmas party, as a matter of fact, and flies to Korea to take command of 8th Army. One of the greatest combat leaders the U.S. Army's ever had. What he's able to do with 8th Army is just absolutely incredible. So here we are in early 1951, the New Year's Eve. Communists launch an offensive, and they push from the solid blue line that you see right there back down into the area that you see the dashed line kind of halfway down the map before they are stopped. And one of the places that they are stopped at is the Battle of Cheopyeong-mi, right in the center of Korea, where the 2nd Infantry Division, along with some attached French, hang on for 3 days. And basically, by holding on, holding on to that key position, they're able to break the back of the Chinese army and force them to stop. And basically break the last combat power that they have. At this point, Ridgway launches a series of counteroffensives. The code name should tell you all you need to know about how what he's trying to infuse his army spirit with his army. Killer, Ripper, things like that. While this is going on, as he continues to claw his way back to the 38th parallel, Truman and MacArthur continue their debate. And at this point, it gets public. Yes, I'm simplifying, but it gets public. And Truman fires MacArthur on April 11th, 1951. There are a lot of people that believe that MacArthur was directly challenging Truman's authority. I will simply tell you this. When MacArthur got the orders to leave, he immediately moved to turn over command to Ridgway. There wasn't a hesitation. So we'll ultimately make it that much more. There'll be a series of battles just north of Seoul, April of 1951, as the Communists launch some counteroffensives against 8th Army. The Communists will ultimately, in these battles, lose 10 plus for every 1 UN casualty. Killed, wounded, captured, and missing is what I use for the term casualty. So extremely bloody battles. But the battle line continues to move north through all of this fighting. It starts right here at the dotted line in May. And here we are by June. They're right up at the top of the map where you see those hatched lines right there. They're making progress. And visibly the communist armies are weakening. But is there a question, do we try to go north of the 38th parallel again? And at this point, both sides are actually feeling pretty exhausted and are trying to find a way out. So they start armistice negotiations the 10th of July, 1951. Now this is really important. It's military issues only. They're going to leave all the political questions for later. They'll occur in fits and starts for 2 years. The reasons we'll discuss. Both sides will break off. 5 negotiators you can see there for both sides. Ultimately, we'll end up at Camp Panmunjom, which is where the Probably seen the photos from the DMZ and things like that. It's a very famous place, obviously, today. Here's the points of discussion. Number one, what's the agenda? Seems an easy thing, right? Here's the thing. It's now dawning on people, particularly in the West, that at this point, this is becoming part of the Cold War that is a battle for prestige between communist and capitalist systems, East and West. And this is one of the first early battlegrounds in the 1950s. So just setting the agenda takes 3 months. Okay? So you get that. Second, let's set the DMZ. That actually takes pretty quickly. It's going to be 4 kilometers wide across wherever the battle line is ultimately stopped. Arrangements of ceasefire, monitoring, verification, they work on that. Recommendations to the governments, that's fairly easy. Number 4 is a real sticking point. Because remember what I said just a second ago about prestige. There are a lot of UN POWs that are captured in North Korea. We're going to do some significant brainwashing, tiger death marches. Have anybody ever seen the movie The Manchurian Candidate? They discuss that in great detail. Extremely well presented about what goes on. Communist prisoners of war have been captured throughout the war. Some of them have been intentionally captured because the communist way of war is that even if you're captured, you're not out of the war. You're supposed to continue to resist the West as best you can, do your duty as a soldier. Here's the thing. They screen most of those Korean POWs in the UN camps. Vast majority have no desire to go back to the workers' paradise. That's true for the Koreans, that's true for the Chinese. That's a huge issue and a huge propaganda defeat for the communists. They are far more interested in, let's do what we did in 1945, forced repatriation. Send them back no matter what. And that's where you get some of the atrocities, if you've read anything about what the Soviets did to people that were repatriated. Even when, for example, the British would hand over German Cossack units and things like that that fought for the Germans, hand them back to the Soviets, and as they're driving away, they hear gunshots. That has stuck in the memory of the West. And so they want voluntary repatriation. The communists want forced repatriation. We talked about the ghosts in 1945, unrest, all this. It's a huge issue. This is what holds up armistice for 2 years. And it's finally when they settle it in favor of voluntary repatriation that it will get it done. But in the meantime, the battles continue. The war continues. And the fighting front for basically 2 years is relatively stable. It has looks a lot like World War I, with trenches and everything like that. There's a de facto ceasefire for a year, ending in late 1952. Of course, you get some positional battles. Heartbreak Ridge, which is an amazing movie, by the way. If you haven't seen it, really fantastic. Air and Naval, of course, pound North Korea. New UN commanders, and by the end, nobody wants to quote-unquote die for a dollar. Because everybody knows that we're not going to finish this. The armistice is finally signed. This is a photograph of it in the building at Panmunjom. It's the same one that's there now. 10 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of July, 1953. It takes effect 12 hours later, and the shooting stops. This is the armistice line here, along the waist of Korea. It hasn't moved since. That's the DMZ today. Both sides pulled back 2 kilometers on each side of their line, and that's the DMZ today. Let me give you some numbers on the POW swaps, just to put a fine point on what we talked about before. This is who's repatriated. You can see 13,000 UN soldiers, 82,000 communists. 22 UN soldiers refused repatriation, 21 Americans and 1 Brit. 325 South Koreans and 21,000 communist prisoners of war didn't want to go back. Many of the Chinese that don't go back end up in Taiwan, where they're welcomed by the nationalist regime. A lot of the UN repatriates ultimately will go back to their countries, but they'll live with the war. My grandfather was a POW of the Soviets in World War II. For 3 years, as he was in the Polish army. He lived with the war till the day he died. They did too. Now this is interesting here, this last bullet point. Remember all those communist agents that got repatriated, that said, oh, go down there, serve the party, and allow yourself to be intentionally captured? They come back, and they are considered tainted because they've been too exposed to the West. Even though they were following the good, being good party soldiers, and following the order of the party, they come back. A lot of the Chinese that had done this end up dying in the Cultural Revolution. And a lot of the North Koreans suffer a difficult fate as well, to put it very politely. But you're welcome to make of that what you will, and what it says about the nature of the regimes. The ceasefire signed the 27th of July, 1953. It called for a peace conference within 90 days. That doesn't happen. So they put this on the agenda along with Indochina at the Geneva Conference, which opens in the spring of 1954. Right around the time, there's a battle that ends called the Dien Bien Phu. And so, which is a whole presentation in itself, by the way. The Geneva Conference settles Vietnam, partitions Indochina, really sets up American involvement in Vietnam, which is a whole talk for itself. But they are not able to resolve the Korean situation. And so the armistice remains in effect. Battle lines don't move, but peace remains elusive. There has been no solution since. There's been very limited progress since. We are still technically at war with North Korea. The war is still technically going on because the war ended in an armistice, but peace remains elusive. People die on the DMZ every single year. And if you remember anything about some of like Operation Paul Bunyan in 1975, if you remember the Blue House raids, some of the tunnels, the way the North Koreans continue to infiltrate across the DMZ, although they've been doing it a little bit less the last few years, because Kim Jong-un wants to make nice. This is still a very dangerous place to be. I'll never forget reading Bob Gates' memoir, the Secretary of Defense, and he said the one place in the world he felt truly, truly scared was in the DMZ at Panmunjom. It's that, it rivals Berlin, it rivals the Berlin Wall, it rivals the inter-German border from the Cold War. It's still that last vestige of it as well. North Korean negotiating point is you recognize our right to exist because we don't have diplomatic relations with the North Koreans. And we'll consider giving up our missiles. Okay, so this is still very much with us today. As a matter of fact, the geopolitical situation in Northeast Asia hasn't changed a great deal since the armistice was signed in 1953. Okay? So we're still here. And because we're still technically at war with North Korea, this, by that measure, is the longest war in American history. We're 80 years and counting right now. Let me make a couple other comments about legacies here. This photograph to the left speaks for itself. That is the Korean Peninsula from space at night. And you can see the literal darkness of communism enshrouding North Korea to this day. Here's the thing about Truman and MacArthur. They were both right. They were also both wrong. It was the wrong war, wrong time, wrong place. It would have precipitated the Third World War. But MacArthur was right. We'll still be here 2 generations from now if we don't solve it. And here we are 2 generations. So I'm going to put that up. Anybody know who this guy is? You don't get to answer because I think you know. Anybody know who this guy is? This is, I know you know. This is Moon Jae-in. Moon Jae-in was elected president of the Republic of Korea in 2017. A month after his election, he came to the United States on his first state visit. Do you know what his first stop was? It wasn't the White House. He went to Quantico to lay a wreath at the Hungnam Chosin Monument at the Marine Corps base. And he said, "Thank you for saving my parents." He was born he was born in 1952. His parents were from North Korea. His parents were 2 of the 98,000 refugees that Ned Almond saved at Hungnam. And he said, Moon said, because of the essential humanity of the United States military, I do not fear for the future of our alliance. The Koreans have never forgotten what we did at Hungnam. They've made movies about it. It's part of their literature. It's part of their culture. They have never forgotten. And the fact that the United States both stands with Korea today and has stood with Korea for the last 75 years plus, really has a profound impact and really is a strong basis for our continued alliance. Mood left office 2021, but I'd like to put that up there as well because you think about these events, oh yeah, they're so far in the past. Asia has a long memory, Korea has a long memory, and because the fact that this is still with us today, it's still impacting the headlines, still impacting us right to this minute. This is not ancient history by any means. If you want to know more, U.S. Army Official History of the Korean War is fantastic. Of course, you've got some great popular books as well. McCullough's Truman I talked about. Korea, the Forgotten War by Clay Blair is fantastic. Do not let its phone book size frighten you. And then a couple of really good popular histories in Mortal Kombat and this kind of war as well. And so as I conclude and open it up for questions, I hope I've helped illuminate some things. We think about Korea, we see it sometimes in the headlines. May not necessarily know what's going on. Hopefully you get a better sense tonight, a little bit more context and perspective. But also realize this is with us, it's going to be with us a long time. And you need to understand this context to truly appreciate both why we're there, what we're about, and how it continues to impact us and Asia as a whole. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Question back there. Yeah,
Do we still have a presence there?
we do. There are, as of right now, as I speak,
Yeah.
there are 28,000 U.S. Army and Air Force personnel in Korea.
Do you know where in Korea?
They are mostly south of, they used to be further north toward the DMZ, but they've since moved them, now use this. They've since moved them primarily based right in here,
Okay.
and then you'll get them mostly, and then Pusan down in the southeastern corner. You'll still have a few up close to the DMZ, but in the last 10 years, the South Korean Army, which numbers 600,000 active, has really taken over kind of control of the DMZ. But we are still very much there. Harry Truman guaranteed that as long as there was no peace, there would always be an American division there. And so the headquarters of the 2nd Division is still there, even though the rest of the division is mostly based in the United States.
Okay, thank you.
That's Truman's guarantee. Yeah, and then I'll come to the front.
Has anybody ever calculated or tried to figure out how many men we lost, or the UN lost, in that long retreat, cold winter?
I'd have to look for the exact number that we lost in the long, cold retreat. I can tell you from the Chosin Hungnam, in the Chosin Hungnam campaign, that was 1st Marine Division was about 15,000, and then you added another 3,000 in Task Force Faith, and they lost about 3,000 all told. But that doesn't count the people that had frostbite and the people that felt the cold in their bones for the rest of their lives. For those of you who are familiar with the Civil War, let me put a perspective on casualties. The 3 years in Korea, about 150,000, 160,000 United States casualties, killed, wounded, captured, missing. That's the same number of casualties in the 7 months from May 1st, 1863 to November 30th of 1863. Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Vicksburg, et al. That's why Lincoln has to go to Gettysburg, is to give the speech that he gives. But I digress. But that gives you an idea. Since this is also a Civil War group, I wanted to...
Alan had questions.
Yeah.
2 comments quickly. One, my former barber was a Marine at Chosin Reservoir. It's wild stories.
Oh, I'm sure.
One. Second, I would recommend a book. The Girl with 7 Names. I do not recall the author, but it's fascinating. It's a young woman who was raised in North Korea, who got to China, who got to Burma, and ends up as a U.S. citizen. But it's just a fascinating book about North Korea.
I think they made a movie about that. I've heard, that's familiar. I haven't read it, but I've heard it.
I think she, the actual woman, has been on some kind of a telecast, something.
That's probably what I'm thinking of.
I don't know if it was a movie.
Okay.
This is not the answer to a bar bet, but it's maybe the answer to a trivia thing, is if you go to the Crane Foundation by Baraboo, Korea got samples of every crane in the world. There's a species of crane, I don't know the name, but their summer habitat is in what used to be Manchuria. In the winter, they winter in a place in Japan. If you look at the map of, the migratory pattern, there's a strip right in the middle of Korea because the no man's land around the DMZ is the only wild place in
That's right.
Korea. So the cranes use the DMZ as a stopping place as they fly north and south.
It's fascinating.
Other questions or comments?
I think everybody wants to get to the Packers game.
Sounds good. Thank you, Fred.